Okay, Mr. Chairman, we are recording the meeting and we are now streaming live to YouTube, so you can go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Good morning. Thank you, Crystal. Welcome to this virtual MetroPlan Orlando Technical Advisory Committee meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Nabil Mohizen, and I will be chairing the meeting today. We also have a team of folks working to ensure that this meeting runs smoothly. Today's meeting was advertised on MetroPlan Orlando's website and social media, as well as through targeted emails. Florida Sunshine Law typically requires a quorum to be physically present in a room for a government meeting. However, Governor DeSantis suspended this requirement in an executive order, allowing government boards to conduct business using virtual meetings. This order has been extended through the end of July. Next, we have a short video to review our virtual meeting guidelines. These will help our meeting flow smoothly.
Welcome to MetroPlan Orlando's virtual meeting. Here are some things you should know. Board and committee members are active participants, and members of the public are observers. Our chairperson will make sure to keep the meeting flowing. Please keep your microphone or phone line muted unless recognized to speak. Make sure to pay attention to your video controls as well. Participants are welcome to use the raise hand feature to ask questions after presentations. This feature can be found when clicking on the participants icon. When recognized by the chair to speak, you can unmute yourself. Please make sure to speak clearly so everyone can hear you. You may also submit questions via the chat box by clicking on the chat icon. A moderator will relay your question. Thank you.
So we'll keep microphones muted unless you have been recognized to speak, and we will use the raise hand feature to participate in the discussion. There are two public comment points in this meeting. Members of the public who want to speak will use the raise hand feature found in the participation tab. If attending by phone, you can hit *9 to raise your hand and request to be recognized. When you're recognized, your microphone will be temporarily unmuted by staff, and we'll ask you to state your name and contact information for the record. We also accepted comments by email and phone messages before the meeting. The guidelines for public comments are posted at metroplanorlando.gov/virtual meetings. We want this and all future meetings to be accessible to all. Participants may join by computer, tablet, or phone. If you need accommodation to participate in the future, please contact MetroPlan Orlando. As this may be our last virtual meeting, I wanted to thank you for your continued commitment, perseverance during these unique times, if you will. You have certainly demonstrated your ability to become very adaptive members. Despite the difficulties, working from home is not exactly a perfect environment, but yet you made it happen, and I appreciate your participation and commitment to this meeting. With that, at this time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Keith Caskey of MetroPlan Orlando staff for the agenda review. Mr. Caskey.
Okay, good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members and all of those attending online. Thank you again for working with us as we conduct these virtual meetings, and we really appreciate your patience and understanding. Unless further extension is granted to the governor's executive order, we expect to have our next cycle of committee and board meetings in person in August. And we're looking at the best ways to do that safely, observing proper health guidelines for our board and committee members, our staff, and the public. Beyond that, I can't really tell you today what our next meeting will look like. And this includes looking for venues outside of our office so that we can observe proper physical distancing. We will be in touch well before our next TAC meeting in late August to update you and to share our procedures for visiting the office in the future. So again, thank you for your flexibility during this time. We learned a lot during our virtual meetings, and we discovered some tools and techniques that will continue to help with public outreach. One example was our annual Transportation Improvement Program public meeting, which we held online this week. And you'll be hearing from me more about that in a few minutes. But we think offering people chances to engage conveniently and safely from their homes is a plus for our process and something we're likely to keep doing when we can. If you missed the meeting, it is available on our YouTube channel along with all board and committee meetings and some other recorded resources. So back to today's meeting, as the chairman mentioned, we'll be using the raise hands feature to recognize committee members during the meeting and to call on members of the public during the comment time. If you've joined us on the phone only without the video screen, please use *6 to mute and unmute your line, and please use *9 to raise your virtual hand so the meeting host can see that you wish to be recognized. You'll see that there is a chat feature on your toolbar, and this communicates with all panelists in the meeting, which includes committee members, staff, and presenters. Please only use this if you are having technical issues or need assistance. A full record of the chat comments will be included with the public record of this meeting. So, Mr. Chairman, that completes my announcements this morning, and there are no changes to the agenda. Now we'd like to take attendance, and I'll ask Ms. Lisa Smith to call the roll so we can confirm a quorum for the meeting.
Good morning, TAC members. If you could unmute your mics at this time for the roll call, and you can mute yourselves again after your name has been called. Please make sure that your video is on so that we can confirm it's you if possible. And you will find the mute and unmute and video buttons at the bottom left side of your toolbar on the bottom of your screen. Please say here or present when your name is called. Naseem Gandor.
Present.
Brett Blackadar.
Present.
Kelly Brock.
Here.
Scott Brown. Christopher Cairns. Michael Cash.
Present.
Gus Castro.
Here.
Steve Noto.
Here.
Ashley Cornelison.
I'm here.
Jeff Davis. Joshua DeVries.
Present.
Hazem Elisar.
Present.
Brad Friel. Commissioner Ed Gold. Glenn Hammer. Will Hawthorne.
Here.
Pam Richmond.
Present.
Conroy Jacobs.
Here.
John Dredge.
Here.
Mike Rummer. Don Marcotte.
I'm here.
Fred Milch.
Present.
Mary Moskowitz.
Here.
Nabil Muhaisen.
Present.
Renzo Nastasi.
Present.
Miles O'Keefe.
Here.
Tawny Allure.
Present.
Tom Radzai. Lee Pulliam.
Here.
Michael Rigby. Rachel Gianella.
Here.
Ramon Sonorens.
Here.
Ian Saconia.
Here.
Shad Smith.
Present.
Matt Sudemeyer.
Present.
Stephen Thorpe. Alyssa Edie.
Present.
Bill Wharton.
Here.
John Williams. Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. We will now move to the public comment and action item section of our meeting. We will now hear public comments on today's action items. Do we have people who want to speak to any action items? If so, please use the raise hand function found at the bottom of your screen or by pressing *9 on your phone keypad. When we call your name, the host will unmute your microphone. You will see a button pop up that says host wants to unmute you. Accept the prompt to activate your microphone. We kindly ask that you provide your name and address for the record. Please hold your comments to 2 minutes or less. Are there any comments at this time?
Mr. Chairman, I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Okay. Are there any written comments that were submitted before the meeting?
No, there were not.
Thanks, Mr. Kasky. This takes us to the presentation and status update portion of our meeting today. We have a total of 3 presentations listed on today's agenda. Please raise the hand. Please use the raise hand function to be recognized. You may raise your hand during the presentation to indicate you want to ask questions, but we will hold all questions until presentations have ended. If you're having audio issues, you can type your questions into the chat box and the moderator will relay your questions to the presenter. Our first presentation is the 2045 MTP status update on congestion management. Congestion management process by Ms. Laura Bach, MetroPlan Orlando staff. There's two parts of this presentation update today on the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. Ms. Laura Bach on the MetroPlan Orlando staff will lead off with the look at the congestion management process. Ms. Bach, please proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, committee members. So I'm back today with the second installment of my overview of our congestion management process, or CMP, update. Next slide, please. So as I did last time when I was here in February, I just want to get started off with a quick definition. So we're all on the same page about what it is we're trying to accomplish when we talk about congestion management. And that is to improve the reliability and performance of our transportation system by reducing the negative impacts of congestion, both recurring and non-recurring. Next slide. Thank you. So just to give us sort of a snapshot of where we are today, the Texas A&M Transportation Institute puts out annually their urban mobility report. And in their latest report from 2019, the city of Orlando, which we'll use as a proxy for our planning area, was the 28th most congested city in the US. On average, the average driver was spending about 57 hours of their driving time in congestion, which caused about $1,100 per capita of annual lost productivity. Well, I think we can do better. We intend to do better. Next slide. And that's where the CMP is going to come in. The CMP is a performance-based approach for us to planning for congestion management, and it provides a mechanism for us to ensure that the investment decisions that we're making related to congestion management are made with a clear focus on our desired outcomes, pardon me. Next slide. So the last time I was here, I presented sort of an overall view of the congestion management process with a focus on our objectives, our goals and objectives for the CMP. Today and for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the performance measures that we've developed as a part of the CMP. Next slide. The performance measures are really the bedrock of the CMP. Once we have an approved CMP, I'll be back to you periodically to talk about how we're doing with respect to each of our performance measures, if we're moving the needle in the right direction, and then we'll be recommending strategies and how we want to proceed with trying to manage congestion based on how we're doing with these performance measures. So what we're measuring really does matter. Keeping that in mind, some of the things that we've taken into account as we've developed our performance measures include making sure that they're multimodal, that they're consistent with federal guidance, that they are consistent with our long-range planning and the 2045 MTP. And perhaps most importantly, that there's readily available data. We want to make sure that every performance measure that we're looking at, we can actually get the data. It's not too onerous to get, not too expensive to get. Next slide, please. So you're all very familiar with the slide at this point. These are our 5 goal areas from the 2045 MTP. They're the same goal areas that we are using for our congestion management process, and I'll be talking about each of the performance measures by goal area throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So we'll get started with our safety and security goal area. Under this goal area, we have 2 objectives within the CMP. Both are related to crashes or incidents. They have a real impact with respect to congestion management on the non-recurring congestion. And so the first objective is to eliminate the rate and occurrence of fatality crashes, injury crashes, and total crashes. So to that end, the performance measures we'll be looking at here include the total number of crashes as well as the crash rate, and we'll be looking at those by mode. We'll also be looking at improving our emergency response and incident clearance times, because when we're thinking about the impact on non-recurring congestion, is really how long it takes us to get back to all clear in the lanes that really impacts that. So we'll be tracking both of those performance measures. Next slide, please. Under our reliability and performance goal area, we have quite a few objectives within the CMP, and I've, for the purposes of the presentation, have divided them into 2 rough areas. First, our reliability objectives. When we're talking about reliability, if you look at the graphic at the bottom of the slide, we know that for those trips that you're making every day to work or school or whatever it may be, there's going to be some fluctuation each day in those trips. And occasionally there is an accident or some other incident that causes that travel time to spike. And of course, that's what everyone remembers. Next slide, please. And what we're looking to do when we talk about improving travel time reliability is just to decrease how much we're fluctuating each day, so that it's about the same travel time each day. In that vein, the performance measures we'll be tracking include looking at the reliability on our interstate and non-interstate corridors, looking at truck reliability, the total hours of delay on the system, and then on the transit side, we'll also be tracking our on-time performance for both Sunrail and Lynx buses. Next slide, please. The other sort of pot of objectives under reliability and performance, I've called our future-ready objectives. So one of those is enhancing our region's ITS and actively managed traffic systems. And the performance measure we've identified there is looking at the percentage of our corridors that are actively monitored. And when I talk about that, we're talking about those corridors that have coordinated or interconnected signals, those with CCTVs, Bluetooth devices, electronic display signs, MVDS, or those that are on FDOT's integrated corridor management system. And many of you that are with us today actually helped with collecting the data for the baseline that we provided this year. So I thank you for your help there. The other objective in this pod is adapting to meet changing traveler needs. And there are several things we would like to be tracking under this objective. One that we know that we can get some data for, particularly within the city of Orlando, is our annual micro-mobility trips, the scooter trips, the e-bikes. Some of the other areas we'll be looking to try and start getting more data. We don't think we're there yet with some of these, but the annual ridership on TNCs, the annual ridership that's being accomplished using autonomous or connected vehicles, the percentage of our corridors that are within a certain distance of an electronic vehicle charging station. Those are some other performance measures that we'll be looking to try and track as that data becomes more available in the future. Next slide, please. Looking at our next goal area of access and connectivity, this is another one where we have quite a few objectives. So the first sort of pot is our access objectives, where we're looking to improve access to both high frequency transit and then also improve access to our essential services across all modes. When we talk about essential services, we're talking about things like grocery stores and convenience stores, access to healthcare facilities, to schools, to government institutions, that sort of thing. So some of the performance measures we'll be tracking in that vein include the percentage or the total average fixed route frequency for our fixed route services, the percentage of our route miles by route frequency, the percentage of jobs and populations that are close to high frequency transit, as well as bicycle and pedestrian access to essential services. And that graphic at the bottom of this slide, in the yellow, you'll see those trips that can be accomplished within a 10-minute bicycle or walking trip. So you can see we're have some coverage, but maybe not what we would like. So we'll be looking to expand that if we come back to report out in the future. Next slide, please. The other pot of objectives under our access and connectivity goal area is our multimodal connectivity objectives. And some of the performance measures we'll be tracking there include our total vehicle miles traveled, our ridership on Sunrail and Lynx buses, our commuter mode split. And then for the objective that we've identified about developing transportation system that really reflects our regional and community values, the performance measure we've identified there is looking at how much we are spending from our TMA funds to support our board emphasis areas, of which there are 3 that really get to the connectivity piece, which is trail connectivity is one of those board emphasis areas, Sunrail connectivity, as well as complete streets. Next slide, please. Under our health and environment goal area, our objective is to reduce air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. And to that end, we will be tracking units of CO2, ozone emissions, particulate matter, as well as other greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. And our last goal area is investment in economic opportunity. And our objectives there are to reduce delay and improve the transportation experience for our visitors. And so the performance measures we'll be tracking related to those objectives are the per capita hours and cost of delay, which gets back to that second slide that I presented for where Orlando is right now. We'll be looking at that for the total planning area. We'll also be tracking the reliability on our visitor emphasis corridors. And if you look at the graphic at the right of the slide, the colored roadways, the darker the green, the higher the percentage of traffic volumes that comes from visitor traffic. And so for those that are sort of the darker green, we'll be tracking what the reliability is on those. We're calling those our visitor emphasis corridors. Next slide, please. So that wrapped up very briefly the performance measures we'll be tracking as a part of the CMP. Where we are right now is we're wrapping up our data collection to get our baseline for each of the performance measures. And we're also wrapping up our analysis to look at where the hotspots are right now, where we have congestion issues that we need to be addressing. Next slide, please. When I come back to you, I anticipate that'll be in our next round in late August. I will be presenting on where those hotspots are or where the issues are that we identified, as well as presenting the recommended strategies that we're looking to put into the CMP and also to incorporate into our NTP and prioritize project list. Next slide. And that's all I have for you today, but I'm happy to answer any questions that any of you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Bach. Anybody has any questions for Ms. Bach? Reminder to use the raise hand function when you want to speak, to be recognized first. Any questions? Great, hearing none. We will now move to the second portion of our of this particular presentation, and it is the 2045 MTP status update on technical activities, and this segment of the presentation is by Mr. Alex Trauger of MetroPlan staff. Mr. Trauger.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Technical Advisory Committee. My presentation will be pretty brief today and a little bit different from the previous discussions where I focused in on really one topic. Today, I just want to let everyone know where we've been over the past year and where we'll be moving forward over into the next 6 months. Let me take control here. You've seen these 2 slides before. These are the 10 tasks that we'll be adopting or working on as part of the long-range planning process. Starts with public involvement and ultimately ends with our board adoption later this year in December. That process, is a simplified version of that, which really looks at existing conditions, understanding that background data, visioning those goals and objectives that we set early on, technical analysis. That's really the heart of where we're at right now with work, and the presentations that you've seen over the past couple months with scenario planning in our needs assessment process. As you know, though, as part of the long range planning process, at the end of the day, we have to develop and adopt a cost feasible plan and see it through in our shorter term planning documents. So that's really the process in a whole. My next slides are really just going to talk about the work that we've done, just to kind of provide a refresh. We've coordinated with our local government partners in developing the trend land use forecast and worked with DOT in developing that existing plus committed network that helps us look at what's in the transportation improvement program, so we can start identifying opportunities and funds to see projects outside of the FDOT work program. Something that we're working on right now, and I'm excited to show you guys in the upcoming weeks, are some interactive web maps that we're developing. A lot of our technical series documents, have those 8.5 by 11 portrait maps. We recognize that our region doesn't serve our region well, with those smaller maps. So we're developing these interactive maps where you can kind of go from our website, kind of zoom in and zoom out, take a look at each of the maps that we have in those technical reports, but kind of zoom into your localized municipality. As part of, as Laura mentioned, and as key to this long-range planning process is our goals and objectives. Just a reminder of what those are. We have spent a lot of time talking about those, and that's important, both for our needs assessment process, but as Laura mentioned in her presentation, for the congestion management process. As she noted, it has been a tradition of MetroPlan Orlando to do the MTP, our long-range plan, in conjunction with the update of our congestion management process. That's required, but I think more importantly, I think it allows us to have that long-term vision rooted in our short-term planning processes for recurring and non-recurring congestion management. Scenario planning, we talked about this 2 presentations ago, but something that has changed since our last discussion. And for those participate on the MTP working group, we introduced that new scenario that was presented to the board, which is that disruption dilemma scenario, which really looks at the perpetuation of our current circumstances into the future. Having that scenario actually provides us a full range, or kind of a full spectrum of scenarios. We have a trend scenario, disruption dilemma, which is a lower growth scenario. We have our technology transformation scenario, which is kind of that tech forward, technology immersed scenario. And then we have our climate consequences scenario, which other than its title, it's actually our high growth scenario caused by a lot of that in-migration, caused by sea level rise. I think it's important to note, and I've said this to all the committees and our board, that we are not adopting a single scenario. We're actually considering all of these scenarios as part of the planning process. So we're not adopting one. We're considering the needs kind of unique and specific to each of those scenarios as part of our needs assessment and prioritization processes. Needs assessment was discussed in length at your last presentation, and for those who participated in our working group meeting last week, saw the kind of the detailed version. We spent over an hour and a half discussing the multimodal needs assessment process for transit, for bicycle, for pedestrian, solving those pedestrian gaps, as well as looking at the data-driven process that we're using for roadway systems management and freight needs. That presentation also discussed kind of the implementation focus of what we are doing, making sure that our long-range plan aligns with the funding categories, so we can implement within our prioritized project list and transportation improvement program. That presentation is on our website or on YouTube as well. So if you want to learn more, hear more about that multimodal needs assessment, there's that recording is up, and like I said, a much more detailed version than you saw at your advisory committee last month. Funding is also, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan has to have a cost feasible element, cost constrained element. So as part of that process, we're identifying federal, state, local, and toll funded revenues. We work with FDOT to understand what those federal and state revenues are. All MPOs across the state of Florida use a similar revenue forecast provided by the department. But we also coordinate with our 3 counties to develop 2 different forecasts, a forecast of existing resources. So basically those are those transportation revenue sources that are currently levied and in place. And we look at the continuation of those sources of collection through 2045. Per federal law, that's the actual revenue forecast that we have to adopt, the existing forecast. But we're also including an illustrative or future source forecast as part of that to provide, really what is our transportation funding vision. So that it'd be in many cases, a much more robust funding plan that includes additional resources and revenues that will allow us to accomplish some of the other larger transportation projects and operating them into the future. We're also ingraining our MPO funding policies for our surface transportation modal split. So how we allocate our federal funds that our board has direct control over to bicycle, pedestrian, safe routes to school projects, there's trail projects, how we allocate it to transit, systems management and operation, as well as our complete street subset. We're also going to be considering our board's policy for premium transit for district dedicated revenues, which up to 30% can be dedicated to those projects to kind of as a seed or kind of new start type funding. So we'll be considering that as we look at projects and local match funds are made available. So that's really where we've been. A lot of that technical documentation's on our website. We're going to be putting more information up there, and of course we'll provide you guys access to that as soon as it is available. But next steps, what you're going to be hearing about for the rest of the year, at your next presentation in a couple months, we'll actually be presenting those initial needs. We talked about our methods, but we're going to talk about the findings. What are those opportunities? What are those projects? What are those solutions? As part of that process, we're going to be using a healthy mobility tool to conduct a healthy community screening. And we're also going to be conducting a pretty comprehensive environmental screening, so we can include any potential mitigation costs into our cost estimates. That's going a little bit above and beyond what we've done in the past, but we think that's really important in providing kind of a comprehensive cost estimate, especially as we look at new capacity or other projects out in outside of our core area. This entire process is going to be coordinated directly with our local and state agencies, as we always do. So you're going to be hearing from us in the coming weeks and months, and we'll be having you, review documentation lists and making sure that it's consistent with your local comprehensive plans. And like I said, at the end of the day, we have to develop and adopt a cost-usable transportation plan, looking at our needs, looking at our existing revenues, and adopting that into the future. And as things change, as more revenues come into play, we can of course always amend or modify our current plan. But as I mentioned, we will be adopting this 2045 plan based on existing resources. With all that being said, this was really the intent of this presentation was really just to be a general status update, and I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks for your update, Mr. Trauger. If you have questions, please be reminded to use the raise hand button and unmute yourself when recognized. Any question for Mr. Trauger at this point? I see none, so we'll move along to the final presentation of our meeting this morning. And this presentation is on bike lane research by Mr. Mike Wilson of MetroPlan Orlando staff. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. This is the follow-up presentation from what you saw at the last meeting, where, as we've discussed in a number of prior presentations that I've done, we've lacked that exposure data to really give us a true sense of what relative risks are when it comes to bike facilities. And so this presentation, with this exposure data, it's going to help us to really answer these questions of, do bikeways or sidewalks really protect bicyclists from motorist-caused crashes, and helps us dive deeper into the factors that are really most relevant to those crashes. It also helps us to answer an interesting question about safety in numbers. There's an assumption out there that that correlation where as the number of bicyclists goes up, the crash rate goes down. Is that really due to improved motorist behavior? What we did is we looked at 10 bike lane streets. These had bike lanes for 10 years or more, and then also selected 10 control streets that had comparable characteristics. So they had the same number of lanes, similar traffic volumes, presence of median, land use, et cetera. And then we have 10 years of crash data for all of those. We, of course, as you saw before, we've classified all of those crashes by bicyclist position and direction and the contributing behaviors of both the cyclist and the motorist. We also did 48-hour bike counts, and what we did is we ran them parallel. So the bike lane street and the control street, its specific control street, were both counted at the same time. We also did measurements of bicyclist speeds based on whether they were on the sidewalk, the travel lane, or the bike lane. Now, you've probably seen other bikeway studies that have shown results of improvements for in safety. But what those have generally done is they'll compare streets with and without a bikeway, or a street before and after a bikeway, and then they'll just do a gross count of the number of bicyclists, the number of crashes, and get an overall gross crash rate. Well, there can be a lot of confounding factors that aren't being addressed in a study like that. One example is from Montreal, where they studied about half a dozen cycle tracks there. So here's a comparison that they did, one set of streets, the bikeway street on top, which was a one-way, one-lane residential street. And their control street was a two-way, four-lane commercial street. Now, which one do you think would have more bike crashes, with or without a bikeway, right? So keeping things all the same, of course, is really important, but also getting into the specific types of crashes and looking at the behaviors. Are we really changing motorist behavior with the installation of a bikeway? And that's what we want to answer. So what we've got here today is that we're comparing streets with and without, and we're counting bicyclists both by their position and their direction, counting crashes by the behavior type, and that gives us crash rates for specific crash types. So we need a kind of a place to start from, and that is the assumption that the kind of the default position for a bicyclist is traveling on a roadway with the flow of traffic. Only 2% of our crashes involved a motorist-caused crash with a bicyclist using a travel lane. Another 10% were motorist-caused for bike lane users. And then the remainder were sidewalk riders, and then also crashes where the cyclist was at fault. So to look at that graphically, as far as bicyclists going with the flow, the four key types of crashes that this type of cyclist would experience would be the overtaking crash, a drive out with a motorist coming from the side, and then the right hook and left cross crashes where the motorist is turning across the cyclist path. Now, the way we estimated exposure on this study was, again, we had a 48-hour count. We multiplied that by the street segment length in miles, and then also by 1,825. What that does is it gets us from the 48-hour count to the 10 years of crash data that we have. That gives us a bicyclist miles between crashes risk rate. And so in this case, the higher number means a lower risk. I would have expressed it as crashes per mile, but then everything would have been 0.000 something and a little harder to understand. So here's just basically looking at bicyclists going with the flow for all four of those crash types. And here we do see a higher crash risk for travel lane users, somewhat lower for bike lane, about half as much, and then 4 times lower really for sidewalk riders. But as we get into this in more detail, you'll see that it's not that simple. Before I get into continue on with the going with the flow, I want to talk about going against the flow. We found that sidewalk riders going against the flow had more than 5 times greater risk than going against the flow. I'm sorry, than going with the flow. This is higher than what some other studies have shown. Also, when we looked at cyclists on the roadway, about 5 times greater risk for the travel lane cyclists and about 4 times for the bike lane. So, but even though it was somewhat lower for the bike lane users, somewhat lower risk, because there were many more bike lane users, there was a net higher number of wrong way crashes. Getting down into the details of specific crash types, first we look at overtaking crashes. And here we do have a significant reduction when we talk about a bike lane, or more than 6 times less. And this is something we would hope to see, right? That parallel movement, improving the overtaking movement is what we want to see with a bike lane. But we also have to keep this in context that overtaking crashes are still very rare. For these 20 streets, there were only 10 overtaking crashes in 10 years, and only one of them involved an incapacitating injury. By comparison, there were over 400 other motorist-caused crashes involving turning and crossing movements, 60 incapacitating injuries in those, and 1 fatal. So when we look at those turning and crossing movements here, here's the risk numbers that we see here. Still lower for the bike lanes and sidewalks, although not to the same extent. But then we have to ask the question, well, why would the risk be lower for those turning and crossing movements for bike lane and sidewalk users? There's no protection at those conflict points. A common assumption is that the designation of a bike lane would impel drivers to be more aware and to look for cyclists and be more likely to yield. But what we're seeing here is that the sidewalk has an even lower risk, and the sidewalks aren't either designated for nor designed for bicycling, and yet there's a much lower risk. Well, there is another explanation for that. Recall that I said that we measured bicyclist speeds. So the 85th percentile speed for the sidewalk cyclist was about 12.5 miles per hour, and a cyclist at that speed is going to need about 60 feet of stopping distance. The bike lane users were at 85th percentile was nearly 16 miles per hour for 83 feet. And you can see the travel lane 18.5 miles an hour at over 100 feet stopping distance. And you can see graphically how important that extra distance is. If a motorist is infringing on your right-of-way, that sidewalk cyclist needs far less stopping distance to avoid the crash. And here we see that expressed graphically again. As the bicyclist speed goes up, so does their crash risk for the turning movements. We also looked at some shared use side paths, right? Shared use paths that were adjacent to roadways. And similarly, we looked at 10 years worth of data for paths that had been in place for more than 10 years. Here we did get a lower crash risk for the side paths compared to regular sidewalks. And with the side paths have comparable speeds, a little bit faster than the bike lane. But it's important to recognize that not all side paths are equal. When we looked at, so among those 5 paths, 3 of them had relatively few conflict points per mile, intersections, commercial driveways. So you can see 3 of them had 4.6 intersections and driveways per mile, and it had a much lower crash risk than the 2 high conflict paths with 11.5 conflict points per mile. And then comparing those to the regular sidewalks in our study, those high conflict paths actually had a worse crash risk. And what's interesting is that the speeds for the paths were about 1/3 higher, as was the risk. Another thing I should point out about the shared use paths is that just as with the sidewalks and travel lane and bike lane, the crash risk for going against the flow is also about 5 times higher. So lastly, we want to cover this safety in numbers issue. What we were able to do is split up all 20 of those corridors into quintiles based on the total bicyclist exposure. And that lowest quintile there, we can really kind of throw out. It has a minuscule amount of bicycling, and in a few corridors, not even any crashes. And so just looking at from the second quintile and up to the top, there were 9 times as many bicyclist traffic travel on the top quintile compared to the second quintile. And if you look at that orange line, which is the miles between motorist-caused crashes, that's essentially flat, while the green line for miles between bicyclist-caused crashes, that risk is 2.7 times lower as we go up to the high risk area and into the high usage area. So what this is showing us that it's actually better bicyclist behavior that is responsible for the safety in numbers correlation. It's also important to bear in mind that risk reduction does not necessarily equal crash reduction. Because we have more bicyclists out there, that number may overwhelm the risk reduction that we get. So we had 29% more bicycle travel overall on the bike lane streets, so that's inclusive of the sidewalks. But we still had 11% higher motorist-caused crash rate. And then the number of motorist-caused crashes was 34% higher. And we also had 6 times as many wrong-way bicyclist crashes. So some key findings to think of this from a factors standpoint is that, again, facing traffic is 4 to 5 times greater risk than going with the flow, irrespective of what type of facility the cyclist is on. Each additional crossing, intersection, or commercial driveway per mile increases the crash risk about 1.5%. Each additional mile per hour of bicyclist speed increases risk about 9%. And as I mentioned just a second ago, the safety in numbers is really due to safer bicyclist behavior. And that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Please don't forget to use the raise hand button and unmute yourself when you're recognized. Any question for Mr. Wilson? All right, hearing none. We will now move to the action items of our meeting. And today,
sorry, Nabil, I have one.
Oh.
It's Kelly.
Mr. Brock, go ahead.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I just wanted to point out that, and maybe in a way that this study sort of demonstrates it, I would guess that most of the facilities that were looked at with this study are nowhere near design standards as far as leading edge of what good bicycle facility design should be, especially considering the volumes of these roadways. A bike lane without separation is not sufficient, especially if you're targeting the interested but concerned user. So, and there are a lot of mitigating measures you can use nowadays for protected intersections to address these risks to cyclists. So I just want to make sure that that doesn't get lost in the message of this presentation, that I think it illustrates we need to do better when it comes to bike facilities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brock. We do have a question from Mr. Shad Smith. Mr. Smith?
Yeah, I appreciate the information. It was very informative. I would like to get a copy of some of that information in the presentation, but I second in Kelly's comments too, and those are good points. And that was actually part of my question is, were any of those with the new buffered lanes? Maybe you said that in the beginning and I missed it, or any other kind of extra striping or anything like that, or were they just pretty much the old DOT standard of a 4 or 5 foot bike lane with a stripe and the marking on those roads,
yes,
or is it?
Yeah, all the bike lanes were standard bike lanes. But keep in mind, that the sidewalk, functionally, I don't see a whole lot of difference between a sidewalk and a separated bike lane. You have a physical barrier there, and you have separation. I think what really needs to be done is we need to see comparable studies in other parts of the country where some of these facilities have been installed to do a similar type of study, because it hasn't been done. Again, they've just done these gross numbers of crashes and gross counts without really looking at the crash types.
All right, thank you both
Definitely.
for the comment and for the question. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. That concludes today's presentations. We will now move to the action items. We have 4 action items today. Our first action item is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on May 29th. And you'll find this information in tab 1 of your information package today. Before I request a motion, please be reminded to use the raise hand button, unmute yourself and recognize, and make sure you state your name. Looking for a motion for approval of the minutes from last month, please.
I'll move
This
approval.
is Shad
That's
Smith. I raised my hand. I'll move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Do I have a second?
I'll second. Will Hawthorne.
Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. I have a motion and a second. Do we have any discussion? Okay, this is a voice vote, so please unmute your microphones for the vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank you. Our next action item is the draft 2021 to 2024-25 Transportation Improvement Plan, or TIP, found under tab 2 of your information package. Mr. Keith Caskey will present this from MetroPlan. Mr. Caskey.
Okay, good morning again. We are asking for your approval today of the new TIP, and I had previewed this on the video last month. And there's a link on your agenda where you can review the draft TIP and then some additional information in tab 2. And up on the screen, with a little advance, let's see, is the one of the slides from the video that shows the amount of federal and state funds programmed over the 5 years of the TIP, which is broken out by the main categories of projects. And then we had our virtual TIP public meeting this past Monday and had a few comments. One person mentioned the need for a single app that would link the different transportation modes, such as Lynx and Sunrail and so on. And then there was also a comment about the need for a better connection between regional bike trails in the area. And then quite a few people had questions about the status of some of the complete streets projects in the area, such as Corinne Drive and Edgewater Drive and Orange Avenue. So there was a lot of interest in that, as well as in increasing frequency of bus and rail service and so on. And the comment period expires this afternoon. And so early next week, we'll be sending a summary of the comments out to you all separately. And then we had a group of panelists that were at the meeting from our local jurisdictions and agencies that helped us answer questions. And we'd like to thank all of them for participation in the meeting. And just to mention that the TIP public meetings that we had over the last 3 or 4 years in person had an average of attendance of about 20 attendees, including staff and everyone else. And the virtual meeting we had this year had over 70 attendees. So we were very pleased with the attendance and felt that the format worked very well. So with that, unless there's any questions, we are asking for your approval of the new TIP.
Thank you, Mr. Caskey. Any questions? I see a hand by Mr. Conroy Jacobs. Mr. Jacobs.
Hey, how's it going? I had a few comments on the TIP, which I wish to have some revisions done that I had previously shared, and it has not been updated yet. So I would motion to approve with the amendments or with the pending changes to the TIP.
Mr. Conroy, what exactly are the changes you're proposing?
I'm not aware of any changes.
I can share those with you, but if you should, do you want me to go by the page?
If you want to just email them to me, I mean, are they just?
Yeah, I could do that.
Okay.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for them before we take the motion? All right, thank you. Please be reminded to use the raise hand function and unmute yourself if you wish to make the motion. I have a hand raised by Mr. Nastasi. Mr. Nastasi, please proceed. Looking for a motion from Mr. Nastasi. Okay, I have Mr. Smith. You want to make the motion?
I can make a motion to approve this item. This is Shad Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Do I have a second? Yes, I do have a second from Mr. DeVries. Mr. DeVries?
Yeah, this is Joshua DeVries. I'll second that motion with the amendments that Conroy had mentioned.
Great. Thank you both. I have a motion and a second. Any discussions? Okay, as you know, this is a voice call. All committee members, please unmute your microphones for the motion. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the approval of the FY 25-26 through the 2039-40 prioritized project list found under tab 3 of your information package. This will be presented by Mr. Nick Lipp of the MetroPlan Orlando staff. Please hold your questions until the presentation has completed. Mr. Lipp.
Good morning. Last month, I presented the preview of the draft project priority list, which highlighted mostly the projects that were funded for construction, and then the projects that were added or submitted by our local government agencies. As a reminder, the project priority list is a bridge that gaps the 2040 long-range transportation plan, our 20-year vision, with the 5-year transportation improvement program of what Keith just presented this morning. And those are the 5 years of projects that are budgeted to be implemented over that timeframe. As a reminder, there has to be a direct linkage to the 2040 cost feasible plan, which is financially constrained, meaning that the projects that we've identified as cost feasible have a reasonable assumption of a revenue source behind it to make sure that it is implemented. And our project priority list is organized to support those regional priorities of the entire MetroPlan region, as well as MetroPlan's TMA funding policy, which allocates a set aside of funds for the urban area for some off-system federal aid eligible projects or local projects. We have multiple priority lists within our project priority list, which identifies federal and state funds, as well as mobility program improvements. The national highway system and state road projects include all roadway widenings, complete streets, TISMO projects, bicycle, pedestrian, safety, and sun trail improvements on the national highway system or state roadways. MetroPlan's TMA funding policy allocates those urbanized area funds into 4 different categories. 32% of those funds go towards roadway and complete streets, 17% for regional trails and safe routes to schools, 21% for TISMO projects, and 30% for capital projects. And this is all how our project priority list is organized for those projects to be funded in the next 5th year of the work program, so the next tip that you will see next year. Highlight some of the changes that have occurred. Just to let everybody know, the top 7 projects remained unchanged on the state road and national highway system because they already had a phase funded in the tip. And we want to ensure that we fund the remaining phases through implementation of construction before we bring in a new project and a new phase into the transportation improvement program. One of the comments we've received from the department, and which I mentioned in the last presentation last month, is that State Road 50, which formerly was under the Colonial Parkway project for the improvement, that has been pulled. But District 5 is moving forward with the 6-lane widening of between Old Cheney Highway and State Road 520. And we've added that back into our project priority list since it's been a while, and we want to give DOT the flexibility to make sure that as they're studying and moving forward with it, that it has all of the opportunities to incorporate. Several other projects moved up this year, largely based on travel time reliability and safety, which are our 2 top priority weighted factors. State Road 436, State Road 438 or Silver Star Road in Pine Hills and Hiawassee, complete street improvements on Orange Ave, also the intersection improvement at Orange Ave and Sand Lake Road. In Sanford, we have the 46th or 25th Street intersection Tismo improvements, and in 192, looking at the adaptive signal system. As for the multimodal list, it was the same. All the top rated projects remain going forward since they already had phases funded in the TIP, and we wanted to make sure we were completing those through construction. And those include the projects that Keith mentioned of Corinne Drive, Edgewater, Orange Ave. These are the projects that had design funded, and we wanted to make sure that construction was funded in the TIP before we started bringing in new projects. Other projects of highlight, Central Ave in Kissimmee, Downtown Orlando Bike Ped Study. The Belle Isle study is underway right now, but the improvements or the corridors that they're associated on have some travel time and safety issues, so they have moved up on the priority list. Buenaventura Boulevard, Mitchell Hammock in Oviedo. Orange County has 164 signals to upgrade as part of the Tismo project, and the International Drive Smart Corridor also moved up on the list. And these will all be considered for the next fifth year funding in that next TIP. The transit projects remain largely unchanged, only because we don't have that dedicated operating funds to implement those premium transit corridors. However, what's been noted is the Meadowwoods, Tupperware, and Poinciana Sunrail stations have all exceeded their parking capacity. MetroPlan is partnering with Orange County and Osceola County to do a feasibility study on providing more parking at these locations. And at the same time, in the priority list, those projects have moved up to implement the design and construction, hopefully within the next 5-year TIP. And then other transit projects Lynx will be working on over this 5-year period will be ITS, customer information, and travel parking system, as well as their system expansion and transit asset management going into the next 5th year. I provided a link of detailed projects. We've received some comments from the City of Longwood, also the City of Winter Park, and Osceola County. So if anybody has any more comments on the list that was provided, please send them to me as soon as possible, because I'd like to mention them to the board meeting as they're looking to adopt this project priority list with any of these amendments on Monday. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I'm looking for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Lab. Any questions for Mr. Lab at this point? I see a hand raised by Mr. Jacobs. Please proceed, Mr. Jacobs.
Great presentation, Nick, and thank you for including the comments that we were provided, that we provided to you. I want to make a motion to approve.
All right, thank you. I have a motion to approve. Please don't forget to use the raise hand function for the second. And I have one from Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, please proceed.
Yes, this is Shad Smith. I will make a second for that.
Motion in a second. Thank you. Any discussions? Okay, this is a voice vote, so please unmute your buttons. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. Next, approval, the last action item we have today is for approval of the MetroPlan Orlando Connected Automated Vehicles Readiness Study. This is found under tab 4 of your information package. And Mr. Eric Hill will be presenting for this action item. Mr. Hill, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This is the final leg of our connected and autonomous vehicle study. And connected vehicles are those vehicles that are on the road right now. They communicate with the infrastructure. They communicate with other vehicles. And these vehicles will become more and more prevalent on our roadway network. Autonomous vehicles are vehicles that alleviate some of the driving task that we as humans take on. This is where we're headed in terms of technology. And so the study itself was to look at how we are prepared or ready from an agency perspective, from the jurisdictions, as well as from the community. And so what we've done with this study is we've completed two technical memorandums, one on the practice of the practice of this technology throughout the country and the world, And then also we did a review with each of the jurisdictions on how prepared they are, where they are in terms of this technology. And then we also had we had workshops in each of the counties, and I'll touch on some of the results from the workshop. But what I'm focusing on this morning are the recommendations from the study. And before I go any further, it's important to note that we're looking at how ready we are for this technology. When we didn't do this to answer all the questions, because there are myriad questions on this technology, and those questions will continue to evolve as this rolls out. The other thing is I want to recognize WSP. They were the prime consultant in this study. Steve Kupiemba is with us this morning to address some real technical questions if you have any. And Global 5 was a sub-consultant to them. We also had a steering committee that helped us procure this study as well as manage it along the way. I just want to recognize the members, Frank Consoli from the city of Sanford, Brett Blackadar from the city of Altamont Springs, Hazem Alazar from Orange County, Tanya Lori and Alex Laffey from Osceola County, Tom O'Hanlon, who represented the Community Advisory Committee, Robert Milia is a citizen advocate and system user of Links, John Slott from Links, and Virginia Whittington of MetroPlan Orlando. She represented the Municipal Advisory Committee. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we did have a public engagement piece of this because we wanted to just share with the public and gain from the public their knowledge on this technology. And so through the workshops, we did identify, some areas of concern that members had or participants at the workshops had. And those were in terms of safety, privacy, and data security. Some of the challenges involved just developing the technology, in engaging or integrating that technology in what we do, and also workforce training. And then some of the opportunities they identified was just educating the public and working, cross agency, sharing the information, working together, collaboration, and then equity issues. Next slide. So the recommendations fall in these 5 categories: planning and policy, infrastructure guidelines, data collection management, pilot studies, staffing and training. Next slide. So on the planning and policy, we're looking for senior leadership here to continue this momentum. We started down this path, so to speak, and we want to continue that. So we're looking to the executive leadership to make sure that they're engaged, they're on board. And this is not only within MetroPlan Orlando, but back at the jurisdictions, and that they recognize that there needs to be some clear roles and responsibilities for staff, as well as the roles that the different agencies play. How is this going to be integrated into the long-range transportation plan, and what we do with our committee structures is important. You heard Alex speak about the 4 scenarios, and one is technology. And so how do we move this technology into our planning process? Because there are going to be some impacts on forecast. Vehicle miles traveled, will they go up or will they go down? Emissions. And one that's really important is, since most of these vehicles will be electric, how does that impact our revenue model? So it has to be integrated, or part of that planning scenario that we have in our long range plan. Next slide. So continuing in the area of planning and policy, developing guidelines and using best practices to determine what kind of investments we're making in terms of land use. One of the things that's becoming more and more prevalent is curb space. How is that going to be used? And there's a challenge now with transportation network companies taking up curb space. But these vehicles, many of the transportation network companies see these vehicles, especially autonomous vehicles, not so much the connected vehicles, as being able to, improve or enlarge their space on the roadway. So as that goes or comes, we need to develop some guidelines for that. And then when you talk about connected vehicles, there are some areas where you can use an app on your phone, and these vehicles are pretty much smartphones on wheels, but you can locate parking spots. You can use that to navigate parking garages to get to spaces or in downtown areas. Um, and in the study, it does talk a lot about parking because that is an important revenue source for some jurisdictions. Equity. Here we're talking about vertical equity. These are socioeconomic issues here, and this is one of the areas you've heard me speak a lot about because technology usually overlooks, passes by, goes around underserved communities. And so how do we integrate and make sure that they are not going to be on the losing end, that they will also benefit from this kind of technology? And then the horizontal equity is the making sure that all the jurisdictions are equal or as close to equal as possible. How can we make sure that what goes on in Orange County is also reflected in what's going on in Seminole County? Now, doesn't mean that in both counties you have the same type of technology in place like we have with our traffic signals, but that they communicate and there's some connectivity. Next slide. Infrastructure guidelines. Looking at what's going on nationally with the guidelines, I know the Federal Highway Administration and AASHTO, they're all trying to develop guidelines, but it remains to see who's going to come forward with something that we can all embrace and follow through on. This involves a lot of signal technology because connected vehicles will communicate with traffic signals, and autonomous vehicles, do they really need to pay attention to traffic signals where you can communicate with that vehicle and tell it to stop? Signing and pavement markings will become more and more important. And the fourth bullet talks about maintenance, but it's important, or will be more important for jurisdictions to maintain these resources, these assets in their communities, because these vehicles use, especially the automated vehicles, they use sensors to see signs, to see pavement markings. And so if they're not maintained, there could be some issues. There is opportunities for us to do more under our TISMO committee in terms of developing policies, developing how we make investments with our resources, and then maintenance. Again, that's more of a local opportunity than it is at the Metropolitan Planning Organization, because we capitalize the system. We defer to the locals to maintain those investments. Next slide. Data. It's all about the data, it seems. But governance, storage, collection, sharing, and security, those are all challenges that we will all need to wrap our heads around. Making sure that we have something that governs how this data is collected, how it's stored and shared. There are opportunities for us to share data, especially under the smart cities umbrella, under smart communities umbrella, and security. We all know about hacking. Early on in development of the automated vehicle technology, they wanted to highlight how easy these vehicles were to hack into. Well, I'm sure that at this point now, they've developed systems that, mitigate that challenge. But again, the collection and the storage and the sharing opportunities or challenges that we have need to be addressed. And there are some recommendations that we do have in the study that help us with this. Next slide. Pilot projects. We do have some pilot projects underway right now. The Attain project, this is the $11.9 million project that we received in partnership with the department and UCF in Orange County to look at, pedestrian safety in connection with autonomous and connected vehicles, smart roadways that operate for connected and autonomous vehicles, not pedestrian issues, but smart communities. How do we, work on that platform or develop that platform that links the various modes of transportation and to help travelers make better decisions? You heard Keith mention that at the tip hearing, someone mentioned we need to develop something that links with Sunrail, but it goes beyond that. There are the micromobility mode choices. There are vehicle trip mode choices. And as we move further into automated vehicles, that becomes a mode choice. So we need to look at project opportunities, and we recognize that projects in Seminole County may be different projects or pilots that you develop in Winter Garden or Winter Springs or the city of Orlando. But there are opportunities, grant funds, or federal grants and funding that will allow us to move and do more pilot projects. And one that New York City is doing and is reflected in Tampa, they're doing connected vehicle studies. And what they've done is in New York City, they have used municipal vehicles, retrofitted them with some technology so that they become aftermarket connected vehicles. In the city of Tampa, they've done something similar, but they've asked volunteers to allow their vehicles to be retrofitted so that they can be connected vehicles. And there are some vehicles that have some levels of autonomy that are involved in both of these studies. Next slide. Training, staffing and training. As we are moving from the 20th century to, we're certainly in the 21st century, but some of the skill sets that many of us learned early in our careers now have to be upgraded. We have to go to version 3.5 or wherever we may be at. But we need to maintain development in terms of training, continuous learning or lifelong learning. And then how do we develop that cadre of technicians, engineers, planners that will follow us? How do we set it up so that they're getting the right training and education so that they can move into these positions to maintain an infrastructure and an environment for this technology? Next slide. So what's next? Real quick history lesson. When the MPOs were created, they were created under the 3 C's, and that's continuous, cooperation, and comprehensive. And so as we move into this area, there's opportunity for us as an MPO to be a conduit of information in this area. Convener, which is what we do, but convene more forums and discussions on this technology and how we can craft and form an environment that not only accommodates this technology, but takes advantage and leverages this technology to determine and manage how our transportation resources are being consumed. We need to look at it as a utility. Vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles are consuming this resource, but how do we manage that so that it's sufficient? And to do this in a collaborative fashion. Next slide. And again, pilots, looking at a way to do pilots or studies. When you talk about the data, one of the interests I have, and I've been looking at it for a number of years now, is the whole idea of blockchaining. Since everything is based on data, how can we implement a pilot that shows how block data can be used and connected in an autonomous vehicle space? How can we show that? Is there an opportunity there for that technology? Pilots that reflect the needs in communities, but also that match available funds. And then the scenarios in our long-range transportation plan, that technology scenario, can we pattern something that will fit into that scenario so that we can do forecasting that will help us see as best we can into the future in how this is going to impact behavior and mobility in our region. So, Mr. Chairman, I believe that is my last slide, and I am ready for questions.
Thank you for the informative presentation, Mr. Hill. Any question from Mr. Hill at this point? Okay, I see none. At this point, do I have a motion to approve the CAV readiness study? Please don't forget to raise your hand and unmute yourself. State your name. Okay, Mr. DeVries, please proceed.
This is Joshua DeVries. I would like to make a motion for approval.
Okay, I have a motion. Mr. Black,
Second, Brett Blackader.
thank you. I have a motion and a second. Do I have any discussion? Okay, hearing none. This is a voice call. This is a voice vote. All committee members, please unmute your microphones. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. Thank you very much. This
Thank you, Mr.
concludes our
Chairman.
action items for the day. We will move to, if we have any technical advisory committee presentations, which we have none today. In your packet, under tab number 5, there's several items as general for your review. Please take a look at that. Our next meeting will be on August 28th. The Technical Advisory Committee will be on August 28th, and that may or may not be an in-person meeting. So far, we are not sure at this point, but as I mentioned earlier, the governor's executive order will expire at the end of the month. So we'll have to wait and see what happens as far as that meeting is concerned. Our MetroPlan Orlando board meeting is taking place this Monday, June the 29th. And it will also be a virtual meeting. At this point, I am ready to entertain any comments that any of the board members have right now. Do I have any comments? Okay, hearing none, we'll move to the second phase of the public comments. And if there's any members of the public wishes to comment, please use the raise hand function. You will be recognized, or you can dial your *9 on your phone keypad to be recognized. We'll unmute your mic after you have been recognized. Please state your name and your address for the record, and keep your comments at 2 minutes or less. Do I have any comments from the public there, Mr. Kasky?
Hello. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we have a hand raised by Joanne Canellis.
Okay,
Yes, please.
okay.
Yeah, I'm Joy Canellis, and I live in 324 Claremont Avenue, Lake Mary, Florida, 32746. Yes, we would like to have 24 hours bus and train service and everything, so no one would be stranded, and that's all over Florida. And I'd like to have my bus over here in Lake Mary as well, that Country Club Road in Williams, so I don't have to walk so far. Right now my leg was hurting because I have to walk over. That's so easy just to get my hair cut and all this good stuff. And we need to have the bus over there at Oviedo Boulevard too for swimming and stuff, so my leg don't get a sore either. And I'd like to have the bus out there at Lake Mary Prep School as well, that 6 transportation, so that so that I don't get hurt and David doesn't get hurt either. So that we can, like doing all the activities that we cannot do today and without getting sore and without getting tired so much. Please. Thank you.
Can I get your last name again, please, stated for the record?
Canellis.
Canellis.
COUNELIS. And my first name is Joanne.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Canellis, for taking the time out to make the board members aware of your concerns, and we'll certainly keep that in mind as things come up in your jurisdictional area. Any other public comments, Mr. Kasky?
No, we have no other hands raised.
Okay. At this point, there are no further business. I want to thank you again for your participation and your attentiveness during this meeting, and please be safe. Have a great weekend, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.